Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session. Today morning, I was just going through the news and I saw this rather controversial statement made by Kanja Ilayya, that pro-Israel comment. So the first thought that came to my mind is, I'll comment on this. I'll write something on this. Then the very next moment, I was like, should I do this? Should I be writing? And I thought of my friends who will definitely say that, no, better not to. It happens every time. They say that, don't write this, don't say that, don't post this. And they remind me of my name and the religious connection associated with that name. So every time, of course, they care about me. They don't want me to be in some trouble. So I was going through, this thought was going through my mind. Then I thought, I have a session with Swara. And I was really delighted because she has the Swara, the sound, the voice. And she is not afraid to voice her concern, to address what is going around her and she is speaking for us as well. So I'm so happy and delighted to have you, and especially we have this topic also, artist as a descending citizen. So welcome. You have done your masters from JNU, and I think you were planning to do your research abroad, and you were part of those theatre groups like Act One, IPTA at JNU, and you hosted this show for Shyam Benegal, Samvidhan, called Samvidhan. So from that very academic background, suddenly you shifted to Bollywood. So how was this transition and how did this happen?
Well, firstly, hello everyone, good afternoon, and just big thanks to the Hortus organizers and team for having me here. I just want to say that I'm absolutely stumped by the scale of this festival and the kind of like really amazing writers and speakers and just the whole lineup over here. It's just so it's inspiring, it's invigorating, and I'm really honored to be part of this. So big thanks to Madhavan sir for the invite and Bandhu sir and all the organizers and you, of course. Well, I think that, India, we as a people, and there's very few things let me at the outset say, I am not a believer in one nation, one language, one election, and all this kind of need constantly to, force like a homogeneity down our throats. So I feel that India's diversity is our great strength. But I think that if there's anything where Indians, all Indians, in whichever region, whichever state, whichever ethnicity, language, caste, religion we belong to, if there is one commonality, that is love for cinema and stories. So I think that, and music, of course. So I was like every other young Indian kid of the late 80s, early 90s. We didn't have cable in our house. And the only entertainment that we had access to was Chitrahar. I don't know anybody familiar with North and DD National and DD Metro will remember Chitrahar. And then there was another show, Super Hit Mukabla, which Baba Sehgal used to host. These two were the only access that I, as a small child, had to films because my dad didn't take us to any theaters. Like, I didn't go for a very long time to any theater. So I was fascinated by Chitrahar and it looked like a really fun world. And then sometimes they would have interviews and I was like, all those actors used to talk about all the fun things they were doing and I was sorrowing with my maths homework at home. So I was like, I have a really shitty life, but these guys are having a lot of fun. So I just wanted to be in Chitrahar and it was as simple as that. And I remember when I first went to Bombay for my first interviews, when they asked me, what is your dream? I said, my dream is to be my photo to be stuck in an auto rickshaw in Delhi at the back because I'd grown up in auto rickshaws seeing film stars' photos in that. So yeah, that's really how I landed in Bollywood. And I have to admit that I never expected that and this is speaking strictly personally, this is not a comment on the industry necessarily, it's a comment on myself. But I never realized that my education would, of course, play a very, very central role in how I prepare for my parts and how I choose my parts and all that. But that it'll, whatever my educational, ideological training is, will also land me in so many controversies and trouble, and because of the kind of line of thinking or belief that I personally have. That I didn't see coming at all. But yeah, I'm, you know, I'm a student of English literature. I was in Delhi University, Miranda House before JNU. And we used to study these medieval plays where there was an everyman. So there were these stories of the everyman. And there were these plays from the 15th, 16th century. And I always say I'm like every kid or every girl. You know, I could have been a journalist, I could have been a writer, I could have been a teacher. Those were the other interests I had. And I kind of stumbled into the industry. And so in that sense, yeah, I sort of scrambled my way around and, you know, made the best of the opportunities I got. And I think I've been lucky. And it's been hard, but it's also been easy in parts, and it's been full of unexpected blessings. And it's been very wholesome, and I kind of feel very blessed.
I think you were doing pretty well regarding your career, doing interesting roles. Listen Amaya is one of my favorite. And I've done bold roles like in Viredi Wedding. I think that was rare to see a woman masturbating on screen, especially on Bollywood. You won the Best Actor award for Neil Bhatti Sennata Supporting Actor award. So it was, and you were endorsing certain brands. It was going pretty well. Then you sabotaged the whole thing by deciding to be the dissenting citizen, or what the right wing call as the anti-government.
This is a master class titled How I Set Fire to My Own Career. I should be the anti. You know how they have in marketing and MBA classes, like they have like practitioners come and tell. I should come and tell what not to do. That's my...
You know, especially nowadays, we always think of the consequences. We are made to. No, we have internalized this fear. So as I said in the beginning, the first thought that comes to our mind is better to be silent. It's very convenient. We'll not be rushing into any trouble. So it's better not to say. And we have plenty of examples. For example, G.N. Sai Baba, who was in jail for 10 long years. He was denied even parole even to do the last rite of his mother or Stan Swami. And I don't think a person like a wheelchair-bound person like Sai Baba with 90% or more disability would pose a threat to the government, or his ideology will topple the government. Still, he was behind the bars. Or Hani Babu for protesting the arrest of his colleague, or Umar Khalid. So we have so many names. But I think this is like giving a warning to us. This will be your fate if you decide to voice your concern, or if you decide to speak. So what do you feel about? I think it's a very criminal offense to treat them like that, and nobody actually bothered. Did we talk about that? Did the mainstream media address this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that as far as the political prisoners, the issue of political prisoners, what we have seen and the manner in which the Indian judiciary has conducted itself is absolutely abysmal. I mean, there's no other words for it. And, you know, they can scare us with things like contempt of court and so on. But frankly, if you don't want the citizens to do contempt of court, don't behave in a contemptible way. I mean, it's as simple as that. So I think that if, and especially the kind of, you know, the judiciary is in place, as we understood in our civics classes, which were very boring, and we had to sit through them and learn about what the roles of all the various pillars was. And we were told that the judiciary's job is to uphold the constitution and to make sure that the government is governing in accordance with the constitution. So if the judiciary has abandoned that role and has become sort of a vehicle for the government to do as they please, and it has in that sense become an executive court, which we have of course seen in many other authoritarian countries in the world, then frankly the citizen is bereft of anything, right? Because once we vote, then for 5 years we have given power to our governments at various levels, whether it's the state or the center, or even frankly the town level, municipality and gram panchayat and so on. You've given somebody power over your life for 5 years. And we've seen how the central government has abused that power in the last 10 years and now whatever time that they are back in their coalition. So, I mean, it's really up to the courts to uphold both the constitutional values and protect the citizens' rights in the framework of those values. And we have seen, I mean, see, there's always been problems of that kind. There are too many cases, there is abuse of power, all that has happened. But I don't think that we have seen such concentrated abdication of responsibility by the judiciary at every level. And I'm not saying this in a provocative sense. I am saying this in a state of deep dismay. As a citizen who deeply believes in the Indian Constitution, I think that we have the kind of collective abdication we've seen by the judiciary at every level is unprecedented. I mean, even in the emergency, there was a Justice Khanna figure who could stand up to Indira Gandhi, and here we have our justices and our various judges giving eloquent speeches at universities abroad and, you know, thinking that their job is an elocution competition. Well, it's not. Your job is to protect the rights of the citizen, and frankly, the examples that you've given, I mean, both Father Stan, I mean, before Sai Baba sir, there's Father Stan, an 84-year-old man who had Parkinson's, and our judiciary and our jail system and the state denied that man a water sipper because his hands shook too much, so he couldn't drink water without a sipper, and they denied him a sipper. I mean, this is the pettiness and venality that we are dealing with. And that man died awaiting bail at the age of 84. It's criminal. I would go to the extent, and again, I'm not saying this in a provocative sense, though I'm sure people will be provoked. I say this with dismay. It's an institutional murder. The death of Father Stan Swami, I mean, the Indian judiciary must answer for it. The death of Sai Baba, Professor Sai Baba, the Indian judiciary must answer for it. That you refused a man who is 90% disabled medical bail repeatedly, and you kept him in prison for 10 years, and then you kept him in prison some more even after the courts had given him bail, so that when he came out, his health was obviously in a state where he was not going to survive for more than 7-8 months, which is exactly what happened. So, you know, there is this abuse of power. We talk about corruption and we talk about many such things, and we, in a generic sense, but when you see it, you see that when institutions that have so much power don't do their job, it costs lives. There is, you know, it's, so in that sense, I would call it criminal abdication, and these are this is what I think about it. And of course, again, as I said, you can try to silence us with contempt of court, but there will be a point when, you know, people, the fear and the repercussion, you'll do it so much that, you know, there's this line, the Hindi sher ki dard something, I'll say it wrong, but you'll get the sense, dard itna bad gaya ki dard dawa ban gaya. We are in that state now as citizens.
But how do we trust our judiciary when the Chief Justice of India was saying that he was praying to God when this Babri Masjid Ayodhya issue was going on? So how do we trust him? This should be based on law, not on some...
I mean, I'm thinking that God must be being like, bro, don't blame me for your, like, bad decisions. Like...
You were participating in this protest as well, and I remember watching one of your interviews, and you said that they didn't arrest you because of the privileges you have. You are the daughter of a Navy officer, your mother is a professor at JNU, and that may not be convenient for them to term a Hindu as terrorist.
I know, I now think I shouldn't say it so much because the universe listens. So I don't want to manifest an arrest and find me and my 13-year-old baby in jail. But I think that there is obviously a certain truth, right? That there are certain privileges that we are born with, or rather the identities that we are born with can come with privilege, or they can come with a certain baggage of historical oppression. I, by the accident of my birth, and I feel no pride in this because I believe that identity is simply an accident of your birth. So it's, it's not any of your own hard work or achievement that you were born in a certain religion, in a certain caste, in a certain class. It's just whatever, accident. So, but by the accident of my birth, I am born into, an upper caste, upper whatever, Savarna, upper middle class, educated, English speaking, Hindu family in India's capital, whose parents were both government servants, central government servants, so that whatever the grade A servants, government servants. And I had access to being educated from the primary school level in Delhi's most premier institutions. And I grew up completely oblivious to the fact that there are people in India, that there are children in India whose identity causes them to be bullied, to be shamed, to be troubled, to be harassed. And I grew up completely oblivious of this because I was safe because of my identity and because of the class where I was born. And so I never knew any fear of one's identity. I never knew any, hesitation about one's identity. And by the time I was old enough through my education to understand that that's not everyone's experience in India, I also began to feel like, well then, if that's the case, then I don't have a right to be scared. Because nothing in my experience in my childhood made me afraid. In that sense, of course, I was scared like a child of the dark and scared when my parents were not around and all that. But nothing in a socio-political sense, I never had reason to fear. So why should I now, when I actually have a platform and have a little bit of influence, how can I now succumb to an argument of fear when I have never known it my whole life? What right do I have to make an argument of fear? And again, I say this in a personal sense. This is not a comment on other actors or other artists or other public people or anybody else, because this is my personal experience. And I think that is where I keep going back to this thing, because I often do think a lot why, what the hell? When you look at and I'm surrounded by, people who care about me, like you said, my manager and my people on my team and my PR manager and my brother who is my severest critic, and he keeps calculating the loss that has happened, like the loss of revenue, the opportunity cost after 2016 or 17, and the loss of awards and brands and whatnot. And he keeps, nowadays, sometimes he calls me and he's like, "Aur inqilab ke angaron se pet bhar raha hai tera?" So whoever understands Hindi will get it. Is your stomach being filled by the flames of revolution? And so he keeps saying this to me. But I often ask myself, about at a personal level, my personal choices, and then I just feel Swara Bhaskar didn't have the right. Not with the kind of childhood I had and not with the kind of privileges I had. I didn't have the right to succumb to fear.
But I think your brother has a point, because they have ways to get at you. I remember when Veeredi wedding was released, there was this boycott Veeredi wedding trending. So they can do that. They can end your... So...
I'm not saying there isn't a cost to pay. Of course there is a cost to pay, and it's been a pretty great cost. I hate to say this, I would have come anyway, Madhavan sir. I've left my husband's election campaign to be here, but, I'm here because I'm not shooting. And I could accept Madhavan sir's invite almost 6 months ago, because I knew that I didn't have a shoot lined up for in the distant horizon at the moment. No, I don't have any shooting work at this moment. And so there is, of course, a cost. But I want to say here that I'm not the only person paying a cost. Many people are paying a cost. Some of them are paying, I'm chalo at least paying the cost voluntarily. I chose to walk this path. There are people who are paying a cost involuntarily. I mean, they are, they are Dalit people, they are Muslims who are getting mobbed in the streets or lynched in the streets by mobs, and they are paying a cost for no crime of theirs. They are girls. I mean, some girls I'm sitting here sitting with a headscarf. There are young girls in school who are not being able to go to school and college because they wear a headscarf. That is also paying a cost. There are so many other people who are not famous. At least I am a little famous, and anything will happen to me, you will hear about it. There are people, teachers, professors, students who are paying a cost without the kind of media attention that anything happening to me will generate. So I don't want to act like I'm some single hero in this. There are many, many very brave people who are resisting what's happening in our country. And of course, those are the people that give us hope. People like Omar, he's been in jail for more than 1,500 days. There are other people. There's, Khalid Saifi Saab and so many of the other people as well, Hani Babu. So yes, there is a cost, but again, I am not paying that cost alone. And it's a path I chose. Yes, it pains sometimes because, I always say, you can say that, oh, I'll take a bullet for the country. It's a great statement. But when the bullet hits you, you'll take it also, but it'll pain because, it'll pain. So yeah, when I'm scrambling for, how to manage my monthly budget, or when I'm scrambling for, I have a baby now, so I want to put her in a school, a good school. And so now my first question is always, okay, what is your fees? Because now I have to budget it because those opportunities have shrunk and shriveled. So yeah, of course you feel like, what the hell? But then again, you come back to thinking, one, what I shared, and the other thing, honestly, again, I don't want to act over heroic. I'm not. My favorite author is George Eliot, and her book, Mill on the Floss, which is one of my favorite texts that I studied, has a line that character is destiny. So, your character and the personality that you are, I believe that everyone has one little part, you can change and grow, but there's something in your personality that will never change, and that will become your destiny. And I feel like that's how it is with me. I am this person. I will not be able to shut up. So now I'm like, I'll just accept it for who I am and live the most authentic life I can live, because my job is to pretend. So in my work life as an actor, I earn money from acting, from pretending, from make-believe. I can't do that in my personal life. Like, I just don't have I don't have that capability, that patience. And if I cannot be true and authentic in my real life, I mean, not to say that I'll praise a film that I don't like at a screening, and when they come and say, how is it? I'll be very nice, very interesting. So I can do all that, but I mean, at a very core level, I cannot be inauthentic beyond a point. And so yeah, this is my choice, and it's fine. Like, I'll live with
When
it.
I read about the news of you marrying Fahad Ahmed, frankly speaking, my first thought was, oh my God, why is she doing this? She has already damaged, she has ruined her career, and now she is marrying a Muslim. See,
It's true. I live up to every stereotype of the Sanghis. That's why they don't leave me, because I fulfill every stereotype of theirs.
See, I couldn't think that a human being can love another human being. They can be together, but the thought is this fear or the propaganda or the thought that the right wing has created about love jihad. And there are even some states, they have passed the bill against interfaith marriage. So my thought was, why? I mean, we have internalized this fear so much. So instead of thinking like it's two human beings, and one curious thing is that I was just scrolling through your interviews and videos. One thumbnail came up like Hindu ya Muslim, kya hogi Sora ki beti. So it's like we don't have anything else to discuss. We are not bothered about mob lynching. We are not worried about unemployment. We are not worried about India being in 111th position in the hunger index out of 125 countries. Instead of that, we are thinking about kya hogi Sora ki beti.
So what is the question? Why did I marry Fahad? Like, do I have to give reason? I mean, yeah, I think that there was a lot of discussion around my marriage. It was also very sudden. I mean, to be honest, it was sudden for us also. We got married under the Special Marriage Act in a court in Bombay. And we got married, I think, sooner than we expected because the main reason for that was that we expected that there would be an objection to our... So under Special Marriage Act, as you must know, you have to serve a notice period for 30 days where your personal information of both the prospective groom and the prospective bride is posted on a notice board in that local court, in the sub-magistrate's office. And because of COVID, it's also posted online. And you know, every other government website will need a login, a password and all, except this website where the interfaith couples' personal details are shared. That's just public for anyone to see. You don't need a password, you don't need a login, as long as you know the name of the area and you're checking by district or area. And so we were sure that, and we know that, of course, as you mentioned, there's this whole myth about love jihad, which is absolute rubbish. Again, I want to say this on record. There's media here. I'll say it on record. Love jihad is a myth. It's a political propaganda. There is no data to show that there has been some particularly high spike in interfaith marriages. I mean, as we become more modern, as more kids go to school, as more children interact from other different whatever, they make their own choices. So whatever, there's no great spike. But we were sure that, and we'd heard that, you know, Hindu right-wing organizations, i.e. utterly jobless people, will go and score these notice boards to see who are the people. And Fahad was like, they'll see your name and 100% there's going to be an objection. So I was thinking, okay, what to do? And I was leaving for a shoot for 45 days, almost 2 months. So I told him, listen, I'll tell you what, I'm going to shoot. Let's just put the paper in. Because then when the objection comes is that, and it's not just that, Maharashtra, after that, you know, there's a case of that man who, very horrible, gruesome case, chopped his girlfriend, live-in partner, into some pieces and put him in a suitcase. So that case had happened just before, while we were just in the process of dating and all. And Maharashtra has formed this Lodha commission to look into interfaith relationships. And it's totally extra-constitutional. There's no constitutional basis to this committee. They actually have given themselves, the state Eknath Shinde government has given themselves the power to stall. If anybody raises an objection to an interfaith marriage, then the Lodha Commission can stall your marriage for up to 6 months to inquire and see if any love jihad or forced conversion is happening. So Fahad was very sure, kuch to hoga, there will be some objection, this Lodha Commission, this, that. So I told him, doesn't matter, let's just put the paper in, dekha jayega, we'll deal. It so happened that we put our papers in on 5th or 6th January, and on the next day or that night, the Hindenburg report came out. And so the entire right-wing social media got busy in defending whatever, that whole mess that started. So maybe nobody saw. So then I finished shoot and all, and I had come back for a break. And they give you a date when you submit, and our date was 16th February. So around 10th, 11th, Fahad's like, yaar, kuch nahi ho raha. So I'm calling my parents, and I'm like, I think we're getting married on the 16th, so you better come. And Fahad is calling his parents and being like, ab main shaadi kar raha hu. So it was quite more sudden than we expected. So yeah, but it was lovely. All our friends were there. It was, and I you know, all our friends came, and our parents were there. My father was one of the witnesses. You need 3. For anyone who wants to get married in the court, you need 3 witnesses and everybody's Aadhaar card. And all our friends were there. Some of our friends who are activists were there. So it was very funny. We are signing and they're doing Inqilab Zindabad and Jai 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 Bhim Jai Bhim. So it was lovely, very uplifting. And we decided after that 1 month to celebrate with our family and friends from both sides and all my relatives from the US. And we did all the rituals that were special to us, that meant something to us and our families. So we tried to accommodate everyone. And it was very nice. Haldi is common to Muslims and Hindus in the north. They call it Uptan, the Muslims, we call it Haldi. Then Mehendi is common to both sides. Then like some music program, Sangeet is common, it happens. And then reception is common. So they call it Walima, we just had a reception. So we did all those things. And as far as my daughter is concerned, for all those who are very concerned about her identity, her name is Rabia Rama. Rabia, she's named after Hazrat Rabia Basri, who is said to be the first female Sufi saint and poetess of Islam. Her second name is Rama, which is a name after goddess Lakshmi, and my Nani, we call her Rabu. And I think that she's the most blessed and lucky child because she has grandparents who are praying to two sets of gods. She has blessings from so many faiths. And I used to tell, and of course, after she was born, I've become very like superstitious and scared. So I'm not all the time nazar and all I'm doing. And I was telling Fahad, let's go to the church also. Because let's get blessings from the Christians also. Like, why not? Like, why leave any religion out? And I think that's the beauty of India. Like, we don't need to be just one thing. Indians know how to be many things and still love their land and love their people and be authentic. And I think that that's how Rabu will be brought up. And I think that's lovely.
You have worked with Kangana Ranaut in Tanu Vets Manu. Now she's a staunch Modi fan. And she has called you and I think Tapsi Pannu as B-grade artist because you were critical of the Modi government or Modi regime, if I can call that. So have you seen that coming when you were working with her?
I don't want to give them any headlines, so I'll be diplomatic. She was very, no, I mean, in Tanu Veds Manu 1, which was the longest schedule that I had because my role in Tanu Veds Manu 2 was quite short. And that was a very chaotic shoot. But I have very fond memories of shooting Tanu Veds Manu, the first film, and she was very friendly and we got along very well. And of course, I want to say that was shot in 2010, 9, 10. And it was not Modi ji's India. It was the original India. It was the old India. It was the India that will be once this dark phase ends. And so everyone was just better, I think. The people who had to change, changed after 2014. And that's all I want to say
So
about
now
it.
we know. And you were part of this Bharat Jodo Yatra. What prompted you to be a part of it, and what do you think of Rahul Gandhi?
I mean, I've said this many times, and again, I have no qualms about saying it. I thought that the Bharat Jodo Yatra was an absolutely fantastic effort and a fantastic way to challenge the kind of narrative of hate and division that the dominant powers, political powers in India have unleashed for the last 10 years. I think it was ingenious, whoever thought of it, kudos to them. And I think it was, again, also kudos to Rahul Gandhi for having, done it and gone through with it. I mean, the man has walked from like Kanyakumari to Kashmir and then he's traveled by foot and bus and car from Manipur to Mumbai. He's literally traveled the length and breadth of this country. And I spent the day with him and I cannot tell you the kind of energy and the kind of excitement and the uplifting sense of just, the collective that I felt. And of course, he's a very sort of stoic and resolved man. So he walks very fast. So he was walking and we were like, all of us. And he was amazing. He had a pain in his knee from having walked so much, but he never complained about it. And everyone would ask him how's your knee, and he was very like, no, it's fine, it's fine. I had a great time. I think Rahul Gandhi is, and I hope he continues to be that way. I think at the moment he is really the kind of leader that India needs amongst, there's many other leaders as well, but since you're asking about Rahul, I think the most impressive quality about him, and of course, this really, I have a soft spot for him, and it touches a chord in my heart, because if there's anyone who's been trolled and abused more than me on social media, it's Rahul Gandhi. And I think that the kind of grace and the kind of dignity with which he's conducted himself, and this is important to note, if you look at him, that man has not really changed his position or his narrative from when he was losing all the elections to when he won a good amount in the Lok Sabha and became leader of opposition to now. Essentially, he took that position and he stuck with it, and he is the only leader who has challenged BJP on Hindutva and on RSS. I think a lot of politicians who are in electoral politics, and I understand why, because now my husband is fighting an election, and I can see the kind of things you have to calibrate and calculate. But I think that it is very impressive that Rahul Gandhi has posed an ideological challenge to Hindutva the way he has. And because he is stuck to his guns, you can see that that gives strength to other people. And in that sense, I think he's a very admirable figure in the Indian political scene.
And I think he was the only person to go to Manipur and address the issue. No
Yes, of
mainstream
course.
media did that.
And you know, it's very funny psychologically because when I see the entire discourse around Rahul Gandhi, I realize that not just his supporters, but actually the people who actually consider him Prime Minister of India are the Bhakts and are the Sangeet trolls because they are addressing all the concerns you should be addressing to the Prime Minister and to the government to Rahul Gandhi. So I'm like, why don't you just admit that you're obsessed with him and that you actually think that he's the Prime Minister? Like, why don't you just admit it?
Now, you might have read about this Hema Commission and what WCC has done in Malayalam cinema. So, you were part of that industry. We know that there is gender disparity, gender discrimination, and that may not end in recent future. So, do you think this commission, this report will have a positive repercussion in other industries as well?
I mean, I want to start by saying that I think that the WCC is heroic. I think that what those girls have done, yeah, please clap for them, really do. Because I think what those women and those girls have done is unprecedented. We have not seen that in any other language industry anywhere in India in the 100+ year history of Indian cinema. So I think it's absolutely heroic, their effort. And I think it is because of their efforts and because of their consistent efforts. See, you can do one thing, you can do an event and you can do a dharna and a morcha and one protest, and of course I'm the expert of that, and it's easy. But to do it and to stick with something that involves paperwork, bureaucracy, hearings, to consistently stick with it and keep a collective together through years and years, that's absolutely incredible. So those girls to me are heroes. And I think that I also want to say, of course there's gender disparity. Of course there is pay inequality. Of course there is inequality of treatment. But you know, these words lessen the horror of the context in which WCC was born. There is crime. What happened and what allegedly was committed or engineered by that actor, allegedly committed by the actor Dilip, that is a crime. That is not a gender disparity. That is not gender inequality. That is gender crime. And that is absolutely horrific. So we must never forget that. So I always say that, you know, women are in this condition where to just do your job, we have to pay with our bodily safety. I mean, that is, frankly, it's a denial of a human right. If these are the working conditions for women in India, that is a human rights issue. And in that sense, I think that the Hema Commission, it's good because we have gotten to this situation because there is a total lack of accountability for our superstars everywhere in India. Men in positions of power, fame. If you combine power, fame, money, influence, stardom, and give it to a man in India, he becomes totally unaccountable. And he's completely unaccountable in his actions. And that is how most film industries and glamour industries and politics, and of course everywhere in India, that is men in power, they have very little accountability. So in that sense, I think the Hema Commission is a great thing because it is going to make people accountable, and it already has. It already has, because I know that there were some resignations that happened after, and then people had to explain themselves. And I hope that every predator thinks many, many times before, preying on younger women and men. And I think that culture of accountability will reduce the audacity with which predators conduct themselves.
And I hope we get to see a movie like She Said, which was based on Harvey Weinstein issue. So now we'll move on to questions from the audience side.
Madam, even though you have mentioned about the Hema Commission report, many have aired their opinions. You have just mentioned about the Hema Commission, At the same time, I would like to mention one thing. That means somehow aired their, grievances. And nowadays, many have also made some kind of opinion, difference of opinion that, they cannot sustain in the field. Because, what they have aired And if they will not get a positive result out of that, they can't be able to sustain, they can't be able to survive in the society. That is what they have said. So, what is your opinion regarding that, madam? Regarding the outcome?
So, what is my opinion? Who said that you cannot? The women have said. Men have said. Have said that you will not survive.
Men as well as women, they have aired their opinion. That means, even though they have made this kind of complaints, so far nothing has happened. So they won't be able to survive for long.
So, like, करना पड़ता है. But they're not doing anything about it. I mean, that's a reality, sir. I feel like when anybody who disturbs an existing power structure and any existing, the way things are in a society, they pay for it because we, as people, as society, we love the status quo. I mean, the conformism is convenient, conformism is profitable, conformism is practical, and conformism is what is taught to us. It is what is sold as being, practical and professional. So nobody likes a disruptor, as I know. So I think that it's true that whatever these people are saying, if you don't just shut up and play along, and if nothing else, just be silent, you will be punished for it. That is a fact. As far as nothing has come out of it, and I think maybe you mean that the women have not gone and have not followed up legally. See, I can't speak for their individual experiences, but from what my experience of such kind of harassment has been, and what my friends have told me about their experience, some of them in Kerala as well, a lot of these are things where when a victim of sexual harassment approaches the court or a legal system or police station, that whole process is so much the onus on the victim to prove everything that sometimes you don't actually have that proof. And there are many cases, especially for things that happen behind closed doors, in hotels, in whatever. What kind of proof are you? There are things that happen where there is no physical evidence for it, right? I mean, not every crime is a rape that can be, medically examined. There are other things where there will be no physical proof on the body, but that is still a crime, and that is still a sexual assault or a harassment. How do you prove that? So, for a lot of times, women actually will not go because what proof will you give? It will become my word against your word, and then they say she wanted publicity and she wanted the name, and the guy is a bigger superstar, you're riding on his name, which you've seen everywhere in India, in every case. I mean, not from now, that from Vishakha case, this is the kind of response that you get, right? So it's not feasible for the victim sometimes, oftentimes, more often than not, it's not feasible for a victim to actually go through that process. And I always say this thing, and this is, I'm answering in a tangential way. There was a case in Bombay, and there was an actor, and one of his old friends and producers accused him of sexual harassment. It came out in the Me Too time in 2017, and he kept saying, tell her to tell me the date, tell me the date, tell me the time, tell me the date. And somebody in an interview asked me, and I told them that, I don't want to talk about her, I'll talk about myself. I have been, as a young woman in India, if nothing else, you'll be eve-teased on the streets or pinched or touched or groped. It'll happen. It's a rite of passage when you're a woman in India and if you step out of the house. Okay? So, as a woman in India who went to school, who went to college, who used public transport, who used buses, who worked in the film industry, who went into markets and all, I have many, many times been eve-teased or been physically harassed. I don't remember a single date or a single time. But I remember how horrible and humiliated and hurt and dirty I felt every single time. And just because I don't remember the date or time doesn't mean it didn't happen to me. And it doesn't mean that it was not wrong. And it doesn't mean that it's not a crime. And that is the complicatedness of this kind of harassment and violence. That's all I want to say.
If we can take up one more question.
Hello.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, why do you think the Kerala government delayed it so much to submit the HEMA report? You were speaking about the HEMA report, that's why I'm asking. And do you actually believe that the left government is supporting the women's right, or are they just showing a pseudo feminism kind of?
Well, I'm not from the Malayalam film industry and I don't live in Kerala, so I can probably say what I think. Um, I don't know. I probably think that the HEMA committee report has something so incriminating about people who are so popular and so powerful that it would become inconvenient for the government and for society in general to have that truth out. There is nothing more dangerous than an inconvenient truth in society. And I think that's the reason why the HEMA committee report has not been published in full, that parts have been redacted, and why the government didn't, whatever their stand was. And as far as the fact of how is the government doing, see, any government will do as much as the citizens make them do. All right. Government, I am a great believer that the state, that there is the state and the government machinery will abuse its power if it's given a chance to. And this is across ideology, across region, across countries, everywhere in the world. Those in power, if they are not held accountable, will abuse their power. I think that maybe the citizens of Kerala are doing a slightly better job than we are doing up in the north with holding their government accountable. And one of the best examples of that is that you have asked this question. And in that sense, you are holding the government accountable. And I think that when the report came out, many people asked the same question. And in that sense, they did make the government answer for what their position has been. So, as far as whether it's a left government here or any other government, or it's Mamata Banerjee's government, or it's in Delhi or Bombay or wherever, I think that gender crimes and violence against women is national, it's a universal problem. It's there in every part of India, in every country in the world. Because that is the one power dynamic that the human race has not been able to solve, because it's so intimate and it's so central to the power dynamic of our most intimate familial relations, right? I mean, gender, I always say that, every ism, Marxism, anti-colonialism, anti-fascism, anti-casteism, all those isms, you're fighting an enemy who is outside you. Only feminism, you have to fight the people you love the most, your father, your brother, your husband, your boyfriend, your chacha, your dada. So, unfortunately for feminism, our fight is first with the people, our family, with the people we love the most. So I think that until society doesn't make itself accountable and hold governments accountable, no government will do as much as it should. But probably in Kerala, maybe you guys are doing a better job, because I think that at least you make the government answer your questions regularly.
Yeah, I have, I wish to know here. Hi.
Listen, no, girls don't want to talk to me only, or what? No women wants to talk to me.
Yes.
They have no questions for me.
Shall I give mic to
No, you
anyone?
finish.
I am ready to give.
No, they'll say men are the real victims, then we're not
Yes.
letting you speak.
Yeah. So I'm so happy that your opinion about Rahul ji. I personally love Rahul Gandhi. I personally love him so much. But from a kind of explanation from you, I was just analyzing what is happening to Congress and what is the style of Rahul ji. It is always discussing and meeting people. That's good. But the problem, the dissenting voice in the Congress is increasing. And it is what is happening to Congress. Just think about the Karge and our Shashi Tharoor, the competitions. And especially the youth, we desire the Shashi Tharoor to be actually the leader. So the problem within the Congress, Rahul ji is not an administrator. So you were speaking about he's the people's PM. Yeah, I love that. But what is happening to Rahul ji exactly? We need the old India back. But what do you think about that? You are seeing Rahul ji as a best administrator within the Congress. What do you think about that?
Okay, so I just want to start with a clarification that I am not in the Congress. I am not in the Congress party, neither as a member nor as anything else. I'm not in any party. My husband is in the Rashtravadi Congress, Sharad Pawar faction, NCP-SP, and he's contesting the Maharashtra Assembly elections now, at this minute, Madhavan sir, and from Anushakti Nagar, which is a constituency in Mumbai. I don't belong to any political party. I'm not a card-holding member of any party. I'm a citizen. I'm a noisy citizen. I'm a citizen who talks too much. I think the questions you've asked are very valid, but I think that is for an office bearer of the Congress to answer. I'll definitely say one thing, that this is my personal opinion, and I'm saying this irrespective. I'm not answering this in the context of Congress. I'm not answering this in the context of governance. And Madhavan sir can correct me if I'm wrong. Countries are governed and administered on a day-to-day basis by the bureaucracy, not by politicians. You need politicians who will allow the bureaucracy to work as per the constitution. You need politicians who will let the honest officers in the bureaucracy do their jobs. Our greatest problem is that we think that the country will be governed and administered by a big-chested leader who will make grand speeches and be a great orator and say some fiery lines and jumlas and make promises that will never be fulfilled and will sell us dreams. And that's administration. That is not administration. That is an election campaign. It is not necessary that a politician who is a good campaigner and who can give good speeches will be a good administrator. In the past 20 years, one of our best prime ministers is Manmohan Singh, and every data will prove that, and he was not a great orator or known for his oratory skills at all. In fact, he was criticized for it, and the media harangued him to the end of his tenure about it, and he said something very prophetic. He said, history will be kinder to me. And that 10 years later, now we are like, oh, Manmohan Singh was the kind of prime minister we needed, and he was better, and he did the good stuff. So I think that as in our own political consciousness, as a public, as citizenry, as voters, we must not have confusion about what we want. If you want a guy who can faff really well and speak loudly and like bajwao, dhol and tutari and whatnot, then you essentially want an actor. Then why do you need a politician? No. All your superstars will do that job. They do it every Friday when their films release. You need people who will... The idea that one man will solve all the problems of the country, I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm just saying that generally Indian public has this idea. You look to someone, and we are, of course, full of great astha, and Indians love making gods out of people. You look at one person and you're like, ye mera bhagwan hai, ye mere bhi zindagi ke, he'll solve all the problems of my life. My problem, my child's education, my father's hospital bill, my wife fighting with me, everything will be solved by this guy. That's not administration. That's dreams. That's magic. So I think that for me, personally, a good leader is a person who will listen to the people and who will let the bureaucracy do their job as per constitution, and when the bureaucracy abuses its power, that leader will hold the bureaucracy and the officers accountable. And in that sense, I think that Rahul Gandhi, but I'll also take some other names. I think Akhilesh Yadav did that when he was in power. I think Rahul Gandhi is that leader. I think there are some... Uddhav Thackeray. I never, as a liberal, progressive Indian, thought that I will one day be sitting and praising the Shiv Sena. But Uddhav Thackeray made me praise the Shiv Sena and be like, I'll vote for Shiv Sena, Uddhav Thackeray group, as a citizen of Bombay, because he was a good leader, administrator. He was a man who let the bureaucracy do its job. And I think that, as a citizen, that's what I want from my leaders. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, one girl asked me one question. I'll give a one-word answer, please. I want in the question answer session, there should be some gender representation. Ask me my favorite color. No girl is helping me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll keep this very brief. But I would like to come back to, the very topic of this, right, where it mentioned the artist part of it. So I would love to know if you would change the kind of roles that you might do, or, probably like produce something that is more political or something more of your, interests. Is that something you would do as an artist, an art in any form that you choose to? Would you see these worlds blending at any point of time?
For sure. Firstly, starting out, I want to say that actors, we choose from a basket that is often very limited, because you choose what you're being offered. Sometimes the offers are not so great. Sometimes you're very lucky and you get a Listen Amaya or a Nil Bate Sannata, Narkali Avara, or whatever. other roles that I'm proudest of. But sometimes you get things that are not so great. But you need to do them because you need to kind of, well, earn the money and also be seen and whatever it is. Sometimes there are many other reasons to do a film. So I think that I'll always choose to I'll try and make the best, wisest, most judicious choice that I can from what is offered. And I think, yeah, definitely, I mean, I'm now, of course, right now I'm busy learning how to be a mother. So being with Rabu takes up a lot of my time, and I'm one of those very insecure mothers. So I want to constantly be around her because I'm very scared that she'll, think that the nanny is her mother or whatever. So I'm living in this insecurity. So, but I definitely I'm writing something, and I'm hoping that it's a very small project, very indie project, will probably not ever be released in India. But I'm working on that, and I hope that by next year I'll be able to produce it and also be act in it, work in it. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Sarah.
for bailing me out and asking the question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sura, for this wonderful conversation. And wishing you keep up the spirit. Wishing you all luck with your cinema as well as your other things you are into. And thank you once again. We love you.